Welcome, everyone. It's so gratifying to look out into this audience and see so many friends, activists, letter writers, town council people, great teachers in our community come out to participate in this conversation. This project started over a year ago when Weston Blaylock, Sebastian Smith, Chris, who's over there, Finley on film, knocked on Amy's door because we wanted to talk to her about our concerns about Wi-Fi. And Amy opened wide her door and we said, we're a little worried about this. And she said, but when I get to work in the morning and I see people lined up in their cars on their laptops using the free Wi-Fi, it makes me so happy. And we knew that we were going to have a series of conversations, and we asked if we could do that. We were so supported by a spectacular board of directors at the library. Doris Goldberg, Stuart Maurer, and Katrina Barber met with us several times a month for almost a year. And although we came together initially with very different opinions about Wi-Fi, we had a really good time talking about where we could take that difference of opinions and how we could be of service to the community by reflecting the conversation that was happening in that office of Amy's in a way that would be constructive and helpful. And this symposium is the result of those conversations that were filled with laughter and good nature and differences of opinions that were worked through and overcome. I want to express most of all my profound, profound appreciation for Amy Raff, who is a person who cares so deeply about this community. As the conversation unfolded, at a certain point Amy said, the scientific evidence is not the most important thing to me. The most important thing is that everybody feels safe and welcome at our library. That's this woman, and I think she deserves, I got her a bouquet of roses and a round of applause.
Thanks, Catherine. Wow, it's embarrassing. Okay, so I want to thank some of our sponsors. The Chronogram was our media sponsor. Thank you, Chronogram. Into the North Woods was one of our sponsors. The Golden Notebook, they're here selling books in the lobby. And lastly, I want to thank the Friends of the Library. They were really generous in supporting this library symposium. We can do so many things at the library because of the Friends of the Library. They're always generous with their funds, so I want to thank the Friends. Are there any Friends here? I see you. Like Catherine was saying, really the library, our main interest in this issue is to provide an opportunity for community engagement. You know, something we've been talking about is that the purpose of the public library is really to improve society, and we do that by bringing people together and creating knowledge together. So I think this is a really good example of how we're all doing that. So thank you, Woodstock, for making that happen. I want to say something about the packets that you have. We weren't getting involved with projections, so there's, in the packet, each panelist has included some slides that they're going to reference. There's also a resource list for books that you can check out of the library about this topic. And on the last page is a survey that I really hope you'll take the time to fill out and leave in the box. And if you'd like to sign up for a newsletter and not be attached to the survey, you can cut them in half and we won't know who you were. So thanks. I also want to thank Sebastian Smith, who was our designer, who did an amazing job. I don't know if he's here. There he is. Thank you, Sebastian. And more importantly, when I would email him and say, hey, can you do this ad in 10 minutes? And he would. So thank you for all of that hard work. There's also 3x5 cards over there if you want to write down your question. At the second half of the panel, we'll be taking questions from the floor, so you can use the cards to organize your thoughts and use the microphone. So I'd like to introduce Kathy Nolan, who will be our moderator tonight. Many of you know Kathy. Kathy has training in pediatrics, research study design, and bioethics, and she currently works as the regional director for the High Peaks at Woodstock office of Catskill Mountain Keeper, and we're very lucky to have her. Thank you, Kathy.
My pleasure. Thank you, Amy and Catherine, and welcome everybody. Really do want to thank the Woodstock Library and especially the Wi-Fi Task Force for putting this program together, and also the Woodstock Elementary School for hosting us. So, thank you. We have exits at the back and on the sides, and there's restrooms out in the hallway. We made an announcement earlier, and I'd like to repeat that announcement about powering down any electronic devices you have. And subsequent to that, we've had a little discussion about whether airplane mode is the same as or better than or in addition to powering down, but we don't want you to turn your phones back on in order to put them in airplane mode and power them down. But for those people who are EMF sensitive, we wanted to create a space that did not have cell phone electromagnetic fields. So we appreciate everybody respecting that. And again, that's not just on vibrate. That's please turn off. Having a Wi-Fi free zone also leads to fewer distractions and interruptions, so we hope there'll be some benefits as well as that reduction in exposure. We have here tonight 3 wonderful presenters and people who have worked in varying different ways in studying question of Wi-Fi and electromagnetic fields and radiation. What we're going to ask them to do is each present some material for us to start to have a common background, a baseline to work from. And then after each person has presented, I'm going to ask the presenters each to go back again and maybe pick up on or reply to anything that the other presenters have introduced. So we get a little bit of conversation started among the panel. And then we will open the discussion to questions from the audience. I do encourage you to write your question down on a card. We would ask that you come up to the microphone and ask your question verbally, but if it's written down, it'll be cogent and brief, and we'd like both those things as well. The forum is being videotaped, and if anybody would like not to be on the video, then hand your card to someone else and ask them to introduce your question, and you wouldn't be included that way. The video will be available several weeks down the way on the library's website and also on discs available at the library for loan and for purchase. The forum is also being taped for Woodstock 104 radio at 104.1, and that will be played later tonight after the conclusion of the forum. So I think that gets us to the point where I should introduce these great folks who have come down and up to join us for tonight. And I'll introduce all of them and then ask that each one of them present in turn. Dr. David Carpenter is a physician, a public health physician. He's director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at the University of Albany's School of Public Health. And the Institute is a collaborating center with the World Health Organization. David's the author of 6 books and hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. And he's, very importantly, the co-editor of the Bio-Initiative Report, which I hope he'll talk about tonight and which is referenced in the materials, the handouts you have. Dr. Martin Blank is a special lecturer in the Department of Physiology and Cellular Biophysics at Columbia University. He's the author of Overpowered, What Science Tells Us About the Dangers of Cell Phones and Other Wi-Fi Devices. That's published this year and is available through Golden Notebook's table in the room just off the hall here. And he also is the author of hundreds of papers on the biologic effects of EMF. Dr. Michael McCauley, who's actually in the middle, is the interim chair for the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health Sciences at the University of West Virginia School of Public Health. And he served for 27 years as a public health services officer for NIOSH, National Institutes of Safety and Health, with a focus on occupational respiratory disease. So these are three people who have looked at these issues pretty intensively. And I'd like them to get the conversation started with Dr. David Carpenter.
Thank you, Kathy. So the question before the House tonight is Wi-Fi safe? And I can say without any hesitation, the answer is no. But if you ask me, how dangerous is Wi-Fi? I have to answer, I really don't know. Now, let me explain why I'm being a little equivocal upon that. Nobody has done health studies specifically of people exposed to Wi-Fi. What we know about radio frequency radiation comes from other exposures, primarily from exposures to intense use of cell phones. Now, let me just back up a little bit and talk about what electromagnetic radiation is. It's the light. Light is electromagnetic radiation. At the very high end of the spectrum, and I should have said that the slides in here attributed to me are all thanks to Martin, because I didn't have time to prepare slides, so thanks, Martin. But electromagnetic radiation are packets of energy, like visible light, that have no mass. And they range from the kind of frequencies that serve our electricity in 60 hertz in this country, up to the ionizing radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, that have sufficient energy so they are known to break chemical bonds. They can cause cancer directly. They cause birth defects because they cause mutations. Now, what we're talking about tonight is really the intermediate form of electromagnetic energy in terms of energy intensity. It's the communication frequencies. So they have more energy than the power lines, electricity frequencies. They have less energy than those that are associated with ionizing radiation. This is radio and television and cell phones and radar and smart meters and Wi-Fi. And what we know that leads me to say that Wi-Fi is not safe comes primarily from studies of people that use cell phones for long periods of time, hold them right directly to their head. And those people are clearly at increased risk of developing brain cancer, but only on the side of the head where they hold the cell phone. The studies that have been done show that for adults, you really only get a statistically significant increase in brain cancer after at least 10 years. But we know from other studies that the latency for brain cancer after environmental exposures, and that's primarily from ionizing radiation, is like 20 to 30 years. Brain cancer doesn't happen the day after you're exposed. So in terms of brain cancer from cell phone use, those of us in public health are absolutely frightened by what's going to happen 20 and 30 years from now. Every kid has a cell phone. I have a cell phone. I don't use it very often, and I don't even know my own cell phone number, which says how often it's on, but I use it when I travel, when I need to. But many people, adults and children, are on their cell phone continuously. And we know from the studies done to date that those people are at elevated risk of brain cancer. Brain cancer is a devastating disease. I get calls all the time from people suffering from brain cancer. Sometimes they appear in my office. And even if it's surgically possible to remove the cancer, these people are left with cognitive deficits, movement deficits, and often it's not possible to remove all the cancer. Now, that's the clearest evidence. The radio frequency radiation from Wi-Fi is the same as that from cell phones. Slightly different frequencies, but the frequency doesn't seem to matter. Wi-Fi is much less intense under most circumstances. One of the things that I am most concerned about is Wi-Fi in schools. Because Wi-Fi in schools, if you have a computer classroom with one router and 30 kids with a laptop computer that uses Wi-Fi, you have a room bathed with radio frequency radiation that approaches the same intensity of someone talking on their cell phone. And those kids are sitting there totally oblivious to the fact that they're being exposed to an environmental insult that is known to increase the risk of cancer. Now, our evidence is best for brain cancer from people holding their cell phone to their ear. But there's also a building body of evidence that shows that children, particularly children, because children are more vulnerable than adults to just about every environmental insult, but children living near very high-powered AM and FM radio transmission towers have a higher rate of leukemia. Now, leukemia is the cancer that has been demonstrated for 30 years to be increased when children particularly, live in homes that have high magnetic fields from power lines and other sources of electricity. So the conclusion I draw, and the issue is where on the intensity scale does the risk really increase? But the conclusion I draw is that if you expose a particular part of your brain to excessive radio frequency fields, a particular part of your body, like your brain for a cell phone use, then you get a local cancer. If your whole body is exposed, as in a Wi-Fi classroom in a school, the cancer of greatest concern is leukemia. Now, we have some evidence, and I should say that much of the evidence in this field is incomplete for a variety of reasons. One, there's very little money to study it. And secondly, it's very difficult to do adequate exposure assessment because as we go about our daily lives, you're on the phone sometime, you're by a cell tower sometimes, you're in a Wi-Fi environment sometimes, you're by a smart meter sometimes, and it's very difficult to quantitate all of those exposures and get a good rubric of exposure. But like any other toxic exposure, more is worse. Wi-Fi, particularly under certain circumstances like a Wi-Fi classroom in a school, is an excessive exposure that I am confident increases the risk of leukemia in those children, probably brain cancer also. Now, there are other studies that are less complete. Apparently, some women wear their cell phone in their bra, which sounds mighty uncomfortable to me. But there are studies reporting elevated risks of breast cancer. There's some recent studies showing young men with an increase in rectal and anal cancer. And the suggestion is this may be because of men wearing their cell phone on their belt in an on mode. It, of course, needs to be documented. It's not at all documented at this point. But from what we know, radio frequency radiation is a carcinogen. It's been rated by the World Health Organization as a possible human carcinogen. My personal impression is that that's too weak. It should at least be a probable human carcinogen. And also there is increasing evidence specifically for radiofrequency radiation that children are more vulnerable than adults. The best evidence for that comes from studies from Sweden in the laboratory of Leonard Hardell, who reported that if you're under the age of 20 when you start to use your cell phone, your risk for brain cancer is 5 times greater than if you're over 20. And if you're over 50, it's much less than if you're in the range of 20 to 50. So, you know, old people like me, we can apparently use our cell phone without too much of a danger. But we need to protect our children. And children are the next generation. And if we just casually say, this is convenient, this is the way everybody wants their cell phone, everybody wants to be able to get Wi-Fi wherever they are, without understanding that there is a risk associated with that, we are failing the next generation. What's going to happen 20, 30 years from now when the rates of brain cancer in young adults become epidemic? Now, fortunately, brain cancer and leukemia are relatively rare cancers. And I don't mean to overstate the evidence that these cancers are going to increase. But in my judgment, the body of evidence that we have at present suggests that these cancers are going to increase because we have this almost exploding increased use of wireless technology. It's everything. It's not just Wi-Fi. It's smart meters. It's electronic communication. I came down listening to Sirius radio. What do you think that is? That's radio frequency radiation. And while any one of those, in the case of Wi-Fi, it has not been studied specifically, but it's the same radiation that we get from all of these sources. And like any toxic exposure, more is worse, and more is going to increase the risk of disease relative to less. None of us are unexposed. We can't be and live in the world today. Even in the most remote parts of the world, there are satellites beaming down radio frequency radiation. But we can take logical steps to reduce our exposure and to reduce the exposure of our family. And there are a number of very simple things that we can do. One, if you're using your cell phone, use a wired earpiece. Keep the cell phone off your body. Two, if you are in a school, of course every child should have access to the internet. Every home should have access to the internet. There's no radio frequency radiation from a wired internet connection. Why do we have to go wireless for everything in the face of evidence that wireless technology poses risk to human health? I think I'll stop there and our discussion will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Excellent introduction and some provocative comments. I think we're going to hear next from Dr. Martin Blank.
Yes, I would like to jump in right after the previous remarks and point out that even unborn children are not immune from these things. There was a study that was done a number of years ago where they wanted to find out the effect on miscarriage. And they found that at certain levels of field, and this is power frequency studies, they found that they could induce miscarriage. It turned out to be relatively high in terms of the kinds of experience we normally have around homes and in general. But the man who did the study said, let's follow up on these children who were born. And sure enough, these children are now about 10, 12, 14 years old. And there's a doubling of obesity. And there's a doubling of autism. So you have this kind of specter of not being safe, even if you're protected in the womb, which is supposed to be able to shield us from a lot of all kinds of noxious influences in our environment. This is an epidemiology kind of study. In other words, you do a comparison of populations subjected to one kind of exposure and compare them to populations of another kind of exposure, and you draw a conclusion. But you can't draw any conclusion about whether it's really true. All you get is a correlation, and you don't get any sense of what the mechanism is. Or in other words, what's actually going on that's causing this, if in fact it is a cause. So you can't really get the causation. And a lot of the people who are saying there's no evidence, in other words, we don't have a mechanism. Well, the answer is There is, first of all, there are many mechanisms. Electricity is a very potent force. It's one of the fundamental forces in our universe. And it reacts with matter. Why? Because we all know we are made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of protons and electrons. Protons are positively charged particles, electrons are negatively charged particles, and they sure do react with electric and magnetic forces. So that these kinds of reactions are bound to be happening when there's that kind of exposure. Now, one of the things that's happened in the last few years is that there have been studies that have been done on the biology, the biochemistry, the biophysics, in other words, the kinds of changes that occur in the body as a result of exposure to these kinds of forces. Now, in these handouts, there's one slide there that talks about expert comments. A lot of the expert comments are based on the looking at epidemiology results. I'm going to look at experimental results, studies that are done with cells and with biological material and the changes that occur as a result of exposure. There was, about in 1995, there was a study done by Henry Lai and Narendra Singh from the University of Washington, where they found that if they exposed cells to, this was power frequency, in other words, this is like the 60 hertz that we get out of the outlets in our home. When cells were exposed to that, you got fragments of DNA, a nucleus which would have its DNA all in a clump, like you normally see on a microscope. After exposure, you got little fragments coming off because the pieces of DNA were being detached. They were broken off. The longer the exposure, the greater the detachment. And this has not only been replicated by many scientists. It was, of course, attacked, and he almost lost his job. I remember having to write a letter of support that he was a reputable scientist doing reputable work because he had pressure from industry trying to get him kicked out because of these experiments. But they've been replicated, and not only that, experiments have been done at higher frequency. They've been done at radio frequency. You get the same kinds of changes. And the DNA will react, and it will react readily. Now, this was a very damaging kind of change in the DNA. At Columbia, we were studying other reactions that occur with the DNA, and we focused on these cellular mechanisms that are there for protection of cells. There's something called a heat shock response, which was known that when cells are subjected to intense heat, which can only be a few degrees, it may be 3-4 degrees in some cases, but then the cells start to make special kinds of proteins that they need to help correct the damage. These are called stress response. They were first called heat shock proteins because that's what they were caused by, a heat shock to a cell. Well, in the work we did at Columbia, we found, and this was with Reba Goodman, a colleague, a cell biologist that I worked with for many years, we published the first study that showed that these stress proteins are generated by exposure to radiation, power frequency radiation, radio frequency radiation, and many others have shown that. So when I give these kinds of talks and I speak to people, I say, why do you have to ask an epidemiologist? You should ask a cell. The cell knows when it's being attacked. It knows by making these special protective compounds that it needs to repair the damage. So this kind of evidence exists now, and it exists in abundance. There's no question that this is what happens. Now, I've also included a slide. It may be helpful to look at it. It's the one that looks like a picture of DNA being unraveled. And I think it would be helpful to realize that the DNA is 2 meters long. That's 6 feet of this big molecule that we've got inside each of our nuclei in the cells. And it is coiled up so that it fits into something that's the order of a few microns. So in order to get this thing fitting into the cell, the DNA has to be coiled many times. So you get a coil, and then that coil is coiled, and that's what the diagram is meant to show. The immense amount of coiling of this molecule that has to go on to get the thing to fit inside the cell and be available. Now, the DNA is not sitting there only, in the cell to say, I'm a cell and I've got my DNA. No, the DNA has the code for making proteins, and it makes all the proteins that are needed by the cell. And the way it makes the proteins is that the DNA, the two chains come apart, and the code is read on these bases. These are the links between the two chains are called bases, and the bases have a code. So every 3 bases will code for an amino acid and so on, and you get these things. And these are coding also these stress proteins, the proteins that are protective. So that means that every time you get a stress protein made as a result of exposure to EMF, you are actually breaking the DNA apart, and you're reading the code to make those particular proteins. How does that happen? Well, if you look at the very exposed part of the DNA, that bottom part where the two chains are actually separated and the links are between the two chains, those straight lines represent chemicals that are linked between the two chains. But on the two surfaces, you actually have electrons. The electrons are there. These are the charged particles that are part of the structure. And it's been shown, there's a group at Caltech that's published many papers. Jacqueline Barton and her group at Caltech have published many papers that show that you can get these electrons to move when there's an electric field or a magnetic field that's causing perturbation in the system. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that when these kinds of forces are out there from our environmental influences, they will cause the electrons to move wherever there are electrons that are movable. And when you've got a highly coiled structure, it's not unusual that you'll get kinks in the structure that will be obstructions and build up a big amount of charge. And I believe that's a mechanistic basis for the DNA to break apart. There's no question that when the DNA is exposed to these kinds of forces, they do break apart. And it's also been known that these breakages result, if they're not repaired, they result in mutations being the initial steps in the development of cancers. So I've tried to give you a kind of a very quick, once-over lightly mechanism that can explain why these things happen. In other words, on a molecular basis. It's not only the measurements that are made on the cancers, which take at least 10 years to make. The fastest cancers are leukemias, which may show up at 3 and 4 years of exposure in children. But some cancers take 20 and 30 years to show up, some even longer. So cancer is a slow process, but it starts with the damage that's done to the coating within the cells. So you should know that there is a mechanism that one understands. If you'll turn the page and look at the next one, this is an even more important kind of result. This is a study that was done in Iceland. In Iceland, the population is small, but it's pretty homogeneous. It's a country where almost the entire population was settled from one of the Scandinavian countries. They came over, they settled there, they're isolated. So it's a beautiful place to do DNA studies because the population is pretty homogeneous. And they've done many studies. They've isolated genes that are related to particular diseases. This particular study was aimed at finding some relation between to autism and schizophrenia, things like that. But in the process, they analyzed, it was about 80 children and their parents, and they compared the DNA of the child with the parents. What this shows, this graph shows a correlation between the number of mutations that the child had with the DNA, with the DNA of the parents, the number of mutations in the father. There's a correlation between the DNA, the mutations in the child, and the DNA in the father. This graph also shows that as the mutations increase, there is an increase in the autism and the schizophrenia and the in the population. What's missing in this thing is the data for the mother. There is no correlation with the DNA of the mother. And the reason is very simple. Little girls are born with all their eggs, and they don't start maturing until puberty, and then they're released one at a time. Little boys are born with the ability to make sperm cells, but that doesn't start until puberty. But then they keep making sperm cells. So they're constantly making sperm cells, and the sperm cells will have the DNA that is existing in these mature cells. They're called spermatocytes. The spermatocytes are subject to the influences of the environment, and when the environment causes a change in the spermatocyte, that will be transmitted to a sperm cell. So when you look at this, it is telling you that males are accumulating these kinds of mutations just by living. They are being exposed. These are not a specially exposed population. They are just living, and they're getting exposed. And the spermatocytes that are making the sperm cells are also exposed, and they're transmitted to the offspring. I think this is a good argument for have your children young, because you are getting a damage, whether you like it or not, just by living in an environment that is rich in all these kinds of forces that can cause damage to DNA. Now, I don't mean to tell you to scare you and so on and make you all say, my God, the sky is falling. I'm not Henny Penny. I'm just telling you what the science shows. And everybody can go and do what they think is best with this kind of evidence. But I have a slide in there which basically says, what can you do? And the answer, the very first entry on that says, stay away from sources of EMF. Just stay away. And how do you tell what is a source of EMF? You can't. That's one of the problems. You can recognize devices, but you can't tell. I have a poor man's kind of EMF detector that's not very good, but it'll work. It's a pocket portable radio. This picks up radio waves. And what you do is you use it, but not tuned to any station, because a station is getting transmitted waves that you know are being sent out by some big transmitter. So if you go to the end of the dial, either end of the dial, pull out the antenna, put up the volume to the highest level you can, and hold the antenna near the source. You will hear clicking if there's RF coming out. I've used it. The only thing is you don't know what the actual level is, but you can sure tell if something is coming there. And if it's coming there, you can then take the necessary precaution. You can tell the intensity will increase as you go closer, it'll decrease as you go further away. So you may not be able to tell what the radio frequency is, but you have a very cheap way of making the measurement, and hopefully the measurement will make you more sensitive to the fact that it's around and that it's causing something even though you don't feel it. On the second entry that I have there in terms of protecting yourself, I put down EM Shield. This is a device, this is a pocket patch that one can put into one's trousers, and it will eliminate a large percentage of the radio frequency that comes out of cell phones. Men love to put cell phones in their pockets, and there's been a huge increase in infertility. You have many infertility clinics have done studies, and they publish the fact that the more one puts this, the longer one uses these cell phones in the pocket, the greater the infertility problem. So it's a relatively simple way. If you're not going to protect yourself by not using it, you should at least get something that will shield it or remove a lot of the radiation. And of course, you can always power off, which is the way it goes. Now, I have in red, I've put down the point that Dr. Carpenter mentioned. Cables can replace Wi-Fi in schools. There's no need to transmit them through the atmosphere. You can have cables coming in and limit the amount of radiation that's available and that's polluting, I use the word polluting the environment for everybody. This way, only those who want to use the Wi-Fi can use it on their devices. Now, the next point I have there is something that gives us all hope and gives us something we can do. It's to maintain health. Our body has protective mechanisms and repair mechanisms. And the way we keep our repair mechanisms working is we have proper nutrition, proper rest, proper exercise. All the people, we used to call them health nuts, who tell you how to live healthy, they're right. If you live healthily, I should use grammar properly. If you live healthily, you will help your body get rid of a lot of the damage that we're being subjected to. If you get a cut, your body will form a scab and repair that tissue. The same thing goes with all kinds of other things that happen to us. We have many repair mechanisms. We've got to keep them sharp. And the other thing, the last point I have on that, is that one should become politically active in the sense that there are petitions one can sign. You don't have to go out in the streets necessarily, but if you can and do, that would be helpful. The point is the politicians should realize that there's enough force in the general population that can counter the corporate influence, which is enormous. And they not only can buy politicians, but they have a strategy which is somehow eliminating support for research in universities, and their corporate strategy involves the release of newer and newer devices at a steady flow rate so that one doesn't have chance to test those that are already being used, and one forgets about these things, or one doesn't have the time to pay attention to it. So we are in a big fight, and we are acting very passively. And I'm not here to recruit you, but I'm here to teach you that this is happening and that there are things one can do. And I think that if you start with this list by things like dealing with Wi-Fi in schools where children are subject to these kinds of influences, I think will go a long way to alerting people that we should really take this very, very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blank. I'm particularly taken with the fact that we can use a radio to detect radio frequency. Really appreciate that. And we've been to the level of the cells and DNA. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael McCauley and ask him if there is, if he can take us from the cells to epidemiology, and ask if you share the positions that have been laid out here already.
Thank you. Well, when I was asked to do this, I was asked to take a somewhat contrary position to the other two speakers tonight. And I hesitated for a long period of time because I published a paper in 1986 that I think shows an association between electrical fields and leukemia in coal miners. So with full disclosure, I have to mention that before I begin. Secondly, I have a story for you. It's about these two people that go up in a balloon and they get lost in the clouds. When they come out of the clouds, they look around them and they can see the ground and they're fairly close, but they don't recognize anything around them. So seeing a person down on the ground, one of the people in the balloon yells down, "Hello down there." Person looks up, sees the two people in the balloon, waves. The people up in the balloons yell back again, "Can you tell us where we are?" And the person on the ground looks up and says, "Yes, you're up in the air." And the other person in the balloon couldn't quite hear it and said to the first person who asked the question, who was that? What did he say? And the other person in the balloon said, "Oh, that was an epidemiologist." He said, "How did you know that?" He said, "Because he told us something that was absolutely true, but completely useless." And so, representing epidemiology tonight, I hope I'm going to tell you something useful. So let me explain how much of science tends to work. Much of science tends to be very conservative in the more appropriate sense of the word. They tend to conserve their opinions and not change them very rapidly. So if you pick up a lot of journals to read articles on exposure to electromagnetic fields, here's what you're going to see. And if you look on my first slide, this is a quote from, of all people, the American Cancer Society. So if you're going to find kind of a liberal group among scientists, the American Cancer Society is a good place to look. But their statement basically says, so far most studies have not found strong links between any other risk factors and childhood leukemia. So that is the conservative view, I believe, and it's coming from the American Cancer Society. So there is this other view out there. And that's important to understand, because in making a decision about what you want to do, about environmental exposures in particular, you have to weigh the benefits against the risks. And you have to decide for yourself. So I'm going to give you some other information, not so much about benefit, but about what some of the risks might be. And then I also want to tell you why the American Cancer Society might be saying what it is. And in doing that, you might think, and you'd probably be correct in saying, I'm kind of agreeing with the other two people that went before me. But what I'm going to be doing is citing my own study. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see something on the left called Hill's criteria. This is a British scientist who was knighted by the Queen for his efforts in science. And he came up with how you can define something as causative. And that's different than a correlation. So let me speak again and actually repeat something, but a little more graphically, that Martin had said before me. What is correlation? If you look at the graph on the right, we see that there's this relationship between the number of ice cream cones being eaten and the number of butterflies observed. Now, if we were to say this was a causality, we would have to draw the conclusion that eating ice cream causes butterflies. Okay, that's obviously not true. What is true is that there's a correlation between the two, and a correlation means there could be a direct relationship or an indirect relationship. If there's an indirect relationship, it is to something else, that there is some other underlying cause. And so most scientists would argue we don't need to invoke electromagnetic fields to explain an increase in childhood leukemia, for example, because we know there are extra infections that may cause it. There are a number of different things that don't need to invoke electromagnetic fields, and these might be underlying causes. And they might be the true cause. In fact, our medical students, when they go through medical school, are taught something about diagnosis. When a patient comes in with a particular disease, the medical students are taught, think horses, not zebras, if you hear hoofbeats, right? So if you hear hoofbeats on the street, you're not thinking, oh, there must be a herd of zebra passing by. You may more likely think there are horses passing by. Why? Because that's the more common explanation. It's not that it's necessarily true. In some cases, it may be zebras. But the principle is look at the most common things first. And so that's what people will cite as opposition to electromagnetic fields. And they will say there has not been causation proved here. And they're talking about these criteria that Hill put forth, which are the strength of association between exposure and disease. In other words, are the two very closely related? So you have to look at that in the scientific literature. And the scientists will look at that, and they'll talk about the statistical association as well as the study of the design and whether it's considered everything that has to be considered. And then you have to look at the next criteria, which is consistency of results between studies. So if scientist A did it and got one result, and scientist B does it and gets a different result, then there's not a consistency of results there. And it may be that there's something else going on again. The specificity of the results. So if scientist A finds AML, which is acute myelogenous leukemia. Leukemia, by the way, is not a single disease. It's a number of different kinds of disease, just like cancer is not a single disease. Liver cancer is different than lung cancer, is different than brain cancer. But if one scientist gets AML, acute myelogenous leukemia, and the other scientist gets acute lymphocytic leukemia, that's two different results. And so you didn't get specificity of results from the experiments. Then biologic plausibility. Is it plausible? So what Martin was talking about before was, is there something that the cells will tell you? If it is, then there may be biological plausibility. But if you can't explain how this happens when you get down to the cellular level, there could be a problem. Is there a temporal sequence? Do you get the exposure before you get to the disease? And can you prove that that was the case? So, for example, if you develop cancer 30 years from now, there's an intervening period of 30 years that you have to explain that you were exposed to nothing else that could have caused that cancer, that it goes back to this particular instant in time or this particular duration of time. And finally, there has to be a dose-response relationship. In other words, as the exposure increases, the likelihood of disease must increase. And that's sometimes very difficult to show because it can be very difficult to measure dose. And so a lot of the studies out there will say, well, we know they were exposed. We don't know how much they were exposed to necessarily, but we know they were exposed. And I'll show you how that works with one of my studies, in fact. The next page over. One of the types of cancer that has been most associated with electromagnetic field exposures in children is acute myeloid or myelogenous leukemia, AML. Now, here's a difficulty. Take a look at the numbers in the red circle. Those are the background rates of AML. So if you have a background rate of 0.4 in age group 5 through 9, that means you get one leukemia in every 250,000 children. That's what that means. So you'd have to have 250,000 children in a study to have some likelihood of finding that one AML in a group of 5 to 9-year-olds. That makes it really, really difficult to study this because you have to have a population in which it occurs. And to have a population in which it occurs, you have to have a very large number of people. And leukemia is difficult for that reason, as I found out when I did a study in this. On the other side of this, people will say, here's the risk factor, okay? And now let's assume that the risk factor will cause a disease. What's the rate at which it causes a disease? A lot of studies will say, well, it's 20% higher, or it's 50% higher, or it's 60% higher. So now, instead of one leukemia in 250,000 people, it's 1.2 or 1.5 leukemias in 50,000 people. So you'd have to look at maybe 500,000 people to see the excess risk in that group. And it goes back to cost and benefit. And people will, what they will argue is that to prevent one extra leukemia in 500,000 people, if you ban Wi-Fi for doing that in your schools, is that worthwhile? So you have to look at the numbers from the studies and know the numbers in the studies and what those studies mean. Because on the next page, I'm going to give you what anybody speaking to the other side will always give you. So if you get a group of scientists picked at random up here on the stage, chances are really good they're going to have a slide just like this one. So these are common, ordinary, everyday risks. And remember, we were talking about a risk of perhaps 1 in 250,000. So if you look down the list, it's hard to find things that are 1 in 250,000 until you get down to forces of nature. So it's a little bit better than being struck by lightning. Although I did meet a lady a month ago who'd been struck by lightning 3 times. So anybody who tells you that lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. But to look at 1 in 500,000, it's about the same as an accidental drowning in a swimming pool. Okay, those are the kind of risks. It's much less than mechanical suffocation, motor vehicle accidents, dying in a fire, drowning if you're under the age of 1, inhalation of non-food objects, deaths from falls, deaths from poisoning, deaths from fires. Maybe 10-fold to 20-fold less likely. And so you have to deal with these kinds of statistics in your conversation to be fair to everybody. So if there are people taking the other side, they are going to say, yes, but it's less likely. Your chance of drowning in your bathtub may be more likely than dying of leukemia from Wi-Fi exposure. And he goes back, and the very last slide is one that I hope you can start to use in your public discourse. Voluntary risks, scientists found when they do these kinds of studies, are accepted more readily than those that are imposed. So if it's you choosing to go out and get in your car and drive, even if that risk of being killed or injured is much higher than doing something else, it's a voluntary risk that you decided to take, and you're likely to be more accepting of that than something that was imposed upon you. The very last one is the one, though, that I think we're trying to do here, and that's public skepticism about technical information. It has to be addressed. Some people are going to say, this person feels this way, that person feels that way. They both have hidden agendas. So I am coming to you without that hidden agenda because, in a sense, I didn't really want to be here. And in addition to that, we've already discussed this, so my 2 colleagues here know what I'm going to say. In my paper on leukemia in coal miners, what we concluded was that, in fact, it was not the magnetic field exposure. It was the electrical field exposure. And that's different. Magnetic fields and electric fields occur together, but they do not occur in the same proportion for all situations. So what may be happening in a lot of the literature is that people have been measuring the wrong thing. Magnetic fields are easier to measure than electrical fields. Electrical fields are a pain to measure. We had some electrical field exposure measurements for our coal miners, and we couldn't put down the actual exposure measurements because we suspected. Oh, by the way, I was introduced as being in the Division of Respiratory Disease Studies, and you're going, wait a minute, why is this guy doing leukemia? Well, the Division of Respiratory Disease Studies also does all the miners and looks at all miners' diseases. And so we started looking at disease in coal miners for leukemias. That's how I got into this. And I have done a lot of work in coal mines underground. I'm from West Virginia, and that's where I worked. So what else was I going to study? But the coal miners would tell us sort of, while nobody was listening, well, you know, it's cold and it's damp down here underground, and occasionally one or two people might go off and take a nap at lunchtime, and they want to sleep somewhere that's warm and cozy. The only place that's warm and cozy are what we call the power centers. And this is where 6,000 volts of electricity comes in and is turned into 440-some volts to run all of the mining equipment. And it makes a really warm place. And when you sleep, you're about that far from the source of the electrical field. For you on radio, that far is about an inch. And that means you're getting a whopping electrical field exposure. And when we looked at the magnetic exposures, they were not unlike what people get at home. And so they were not different than our control group. And what we found in our study was over a 6-fold excess risk of chronic lymphocytic leukemia. If you want to look it up, it was in the Journal of Occupational Medicine, volume 14. I'll give you a second to get your pens out. I can see people grabbing furiously for paper and pen. Okay. Journal of Occupational Medicine, volume 14, pages 271 to 281. And I'm going to leave a copy for the library. The major author, the primary author on this, was Gilman, Gilman. She was a hematologist, physician. And so it may be that some of the difficulties that we've been seeing in getting one study to jive with another might be that they were looking at magnetic fields, not electrical fields, and maybe it's the electrical field. Or maybe it's the electrical field and the magnetic field. Or maybe it's the electrical field and the magnetic field and the infections and all of these other things. You remember there's an old kind of poem that goes, for want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a rider was lost. For want of a rider, the war was lost. Which one was the cause? You see, in reality, in real life, and as in science, sometimes there's not just one cause that you can point to. There are all of these things happening. And so that makes it difficult for us as scientists, and it makes it difficult for you as the public to make these benefit decisions. And it takes a public discourse to do that, preferably where you're nice to one another. Because we as scientists don't hold some mighty truth. We hold our own little piece of the truth, I hope. And you can take away some of those pieces and you can develop your own reading and understanding and finding out more about this. You've got Google hardwired into your computer, I hope.
Thank you, Dr. McCauley. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether to feel reassured or more worried from your presentation, but I want to give the other panelists a chance to make that analysis. And I just want to throw in one thing as I hand the floor back to Dr. Carpenter, which is we've talked a lot about leukemia and other tumors. Maybe in addressing the question again, is Wi-Fi safe, would you also bring up the question we raised about EM sensitive people? And can I use that as a reminder if anybody didn't already turn off your electromagnetically charged equipment, please do so now, especially if you're a man and you want to be fertile. So can we look again, in light of some of the comments, at is Wi-Fi safe, and if it's not safe, what are the risks and how do we avoid them?
Could I just interject here? Because when I submitted slides, I submitted an extra one, which I thought would be interesting to see. And if you'll turn back, it's the one at the end of my presentation. It's a sculpture, which I think summarizes the situation we're in. In other words, we are not discussing a problem in abstract. The title of this is Politicians Discussing Global Warming. And here you have the politicians standing there, shoulder deep in water as a result of melting ice cap in global warming. I think we're in a similar situation with the EMF problem as it's growing. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Sure, we'll come back to you again.
Yeah.
Dr. Carpenter?
Well, I think Michael sort of said at the beginning that he was playing the devil's advocate, and I'm not sure he believes what he said. But in some regards, I certainly acknowledge and don't disagree with him on a lot of these issues. It is true that we all accept some risks. You know, a good example, I teach safety in my class. And for years, I taught that, you know, people should always have a handrail on their stairs because falls are very dangerous. And did I have a handrail on the stairs in my house? No. But when the insurance company came and said, if you don't have handrails, we're going to increase your insurance rate, I got handrails on my stairs very quickly. You know, the point is that most of us drive cars. We realize there's a hazard there, and we know the danger, and we choose to drive cars. Most of us abide by the laws. My concern about the whole issue of Wi-Fi, and especially radio frequency radiation, is the public does not know and understand how strong the evidence is that this is dangerous. Now, it may be that brain cancer and leukemia are relatively rare diseases, and it may be, you know, that only one person in this room is going to develop brain cancer and another one person is going to develop leukemia. That is no reason for all of us to ignore that there is clearly an elevated risk. Now, I focus my comments almost exclusively on cancer intentionally because that's the disease for which the evidence is strongest. It's by no means the only disease for which there is evidence, various levels of being convincing, that there are problems with radiofrequency radiation. There is strong evidence for decreased male fertility. Martin mentioned some of the female fertility issues. But men that wear their cell phones in their belt, that may be less hassle than a condom, but it's going to reduce your fertility. And I'm not sure that it's a wise thing to do, because there is also some evidence that it's going to increase abdominal cancers. Not well documented, but evidence is growing. So the fertility is an issue. For the power lines fields, less so for the radio frequency fields, there's really quite strong evidence that high exposure increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, people say we don't understand the mechanism for electromagnetic field effects. Well, we have no real clue on the cause of Alzheimer's disease. I gave a lecture on Alzheimer's disease to Albany medical students on Wednesday this week. We have a lot of information, but we don't know what causes Alzheimer's disease. We know it's increasing. We know that age is a major risk factor, but even adjusting for age, the incidence of Alzheimer's is increasing. Now, one can say the association is that Alzheimer's is increasing along with our use of radiofrequency radiations. That is an association. It doesn't prove causation, but Alzheimer's is probably the worst thing that can happen to any adult as they grow older. So Kathy asked me to talk a little bit about electrohypersensitivity. This is a controversial area. It's an area where I was really quite skeptical until probably 10 years ago that this was a real disease. There are some people who, in the presence of radiofrequency fields or even 60 hertz power line fields, suffer headaches, dizziness, a general feeling of ill health, often weakness. Some people are so severely incapacitated that they barely can leave their house. They cannot go to public places. You can't go into a McDonald's or a Starbucks without being in a Wi-Fi environment. And extremely sensitive people cannot go to those places. This is one of the reasons why we've asked that all cell phones be turned off in this room tonight, because there are people here that are electrically sensitive. I get calls from these people all the time. Now, of the studies that have been done, many of them report that electrosensitive people, if you take them into the laboratory, can't tell whether there are fields on or not. And therefore, most physicians send these people to psychiatrists and say it's all in your head. But there are other studies that have taken people that report that they are electrosensitive and take them into the laboratory, and about half of them they respond with symptoms when they're in the presence of fields. One of the best studies was with a female physician who was taken into a very high-tech neurology laboratory in Louisiana. And when she was exposed to fields, she got headaches. When the fields were not on, she didn't have a headache. So this is a real syndrome. It still is controversial. We don't know the mechanism of it. This is something I've gotten very interested in because it's very similar to other syndromes that are called medically unexplained symptoms. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity. I have a project on Gulf War illness. The veterans of the 1990-1991 Gulf War have these syndromes of chronic pain, headaches, mental brain fog, they say. Their brain their cognitive function doesn't work as well. So these are areas that need a lot more attention, a lot more study. It is a real disease. We don't know exactly what it is caused by, but we know that there are people that are severely disabled because of this disease. Now, once again, the question is this syndrome going to increase? And I've had a very interesting experience. I was involved in a case of a technician working for Verizon in California who was asked to go into a generator room that had 7 different radio frequency generators that all were supposed to be turned off. 4 of them were turned off, 3 of them were not. And he worked in that room for about an hour, developed a splitting headache, nausea and vomiting, and that was 3 years ago. And he still has every symptom of electrohypersensitivity. Chronic headaches, chronic pain, intense photophobia, light hurts, incredible fatigue, and a sense of mental dullness. Now, that's not psychological. Now, not every person with electrohypersensitivity can point to one particular experience of excessive exposure, but I've had personal reports of a number of people that did have this. For most people with EHS, which is what we call this syndrome, they just slowly find that they don't feel well when they're in the presence of radiofrequency fields. I'm concerned, again, that if we have Wi-Fi in school classrooms, where children are exposed to high-intensity radio frequency fields for long periods of time, a certain number of those children are going to develop this syndrome that's going to be incapacitating for the rest of their life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Dr. Blank, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to some of the other presentations, and also ask you, if you would, while you're doing that, maybe talk a little bit, if you can, about dirty electricity, and whether your claim that if we could cable instead of Wi-Fi, that we would reduce the EMF, but would we be really taking risk down to zero or down considerably if we're not dealing with electrical currents?
Let me first add something to what Dr. Carpenter said in terms of the electrohypersensitivity. One of the poster the poster people for the electrohypersensitivity is Grove Brundtland, the former head of the WHO office that dealt with these health problems, former Prime Minister of Norway. She developed this electrohypersensitivity as a result of some exposure, an optical exposure, something as a result of chemicals. But anyway, everybody in that office knew that she could detect when a cell phone was being used. And there's no question about her. She actually eventually gave up the job because of, I assume, because of her inability to function that way. But you can say some people are making these things up, but someone with that, public exposure and that kind of a reputation is pretty hard to refute. She was a real genuine case. And I think that the the electrical hypersensitivity has been done very well, very demonstrated. That doctor in Texas, is his name what, Rhea? Dr. Rhea from the, is it Dallas? What's that?
Dr. Ray, yes.
Yeah, okay. So those studies certainly have held up, and people, people point to them as being studies that could remove a lot of doubts. Now, in terms of commenting, you wanted me to speak specifically about dirty electricity. There isn't much one can say in terms of our electrical supply comes from powerhouses where they send out nice clean signals, sort of, and then we take them into our homes and we use them in circuits which connect them to all kinds of other devices. The result of this, these other devices kind of churn this electricity. They use the power, and then they somehow generate different frequencies of their own. And the result is that this ends up going onto the line. And when you get 60 hertz power from the power company, instead of getting this nice smooth sine wave, which we all see in physics textbooks, the fact of the matter is it's got this overlay of all kinds of frequencies on it, even though you've got the sine wave on it. And this is the stuff that is supposedly very harmful, because studies that have been done by Sam Milham, who is an engineer epidemiologist, or I guess he's an epidemiologist who's done a lot of this thing. I remember seeing him at meetings of the Bioelectromagnetic Society, walking around checking the various outlets in the rooms that we were using. He never stopped working. And he's got a book called Dirty Electricity, where he points out that this thing is really a real problem, and people can be affected by it. So it's really something that is a result of using these devices in a real world. In other words, there are also problems that come from improper grounding. In order to prevent shock, we ground a lot of electrical equipment so that we take all this extra power and protect ourselves by having it connected to the ground, which is a good sink in case we get a surge of some kind of electricity. Well, the result is that the ground gets polluted, in effect. So most ground is bad. Now, people tell you that grounding is great, walking with bare feet on the ground. It depends on which ground you're walking on. Some grounds are just pretty bad. They are in some cases even dangerous to walk on. So there was an article recently online published by Dr. Furstenberg, who is an electrohypersensitive case that is really a fascinating tragedy. He was a medical student who was, I think, going into his third year, doing very well. And when he got into the operating rooms with all this electronic equipment, he suddenly couldn't function. Enormous headaches and so on. And he had to drop out of medical school. And he now lives in Santa Fe and publishes a newsletter and information on this problem. But it's a personal tragedy. Some people reach this stage where they can really not function in society the way it's constructed. Now, there are ways that people who sell devices that one can put into the outlets to eliminate this, or minimize this dirty electricity, and that usually helps. But it's hit and miss. I don't know if that's, well, then I'll pass the baton to the next runner.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Blank. Dr. McCauley, give you a chance to respond again, and also ask you, you talked about the chart in which you were looking at the incidence of leukemia, AML, in children at 5 years old, and what you would need to see a rise in background. But you wouldn't actually be able to see the increase if you were always looking at 5-year-olds, right? If we're talking about latency periods. Right. So I'd like you to maybe address the question of latency for the various measures that we're looking at, and how that can make it more difficult to parse things.
Yeah, when we do an epidemiology kind of study, much of the exposures have already taken place. And so we have to reconstruct exposure. Occasionally, an epidemiologist will do what's called a prospective study, where they begin today and start looking forward. And it's easy then because you can take the measurements now while they're happening and then wait to see what occurs because of that. The difficulty is those tend to be really expensive experiments because they have to be conducted over a long period of time. So you have to have a staff and all of this other stuff that goes with it. Whereas taking a person who has a disease and trying to reconstruct what their exposure was, and that's called a retrospective exposure study, that's much less expensive to do because you sit the person down and say, okay, we're going to go over what it is you've been exposed to. Tell me all of your magnetic field exposures. That's the problem. It's difficult, even if you know what you're being exposed to in certain, if I asked you what all of your hydrogen sulfide exposures were, hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs. And in fact, Dr. Carpenter just did a study of hydrogen sulfide exposures, so it's really good. But you'll remember hydrogen sulfide exposures, but the question is, if I ask you, were you exposed to hydrogen sulfide on December 10th, 1981? You'll go, what day of the week was that? And so trying to reconstruct that over some period of time, particularly if you're a 5 to 9-year-old, and your parents may not know exactly what you were doing during the day. When I was 5 years old, I stuck a magnet in an electrical socket and got a real electrical field exposure. That's the only one I remember. And so you have that constant difficulty in trying to do dose reconstruction, as we call it. And you'll get a lot of skepticism over how well you've done it, how well you've reconstructed it, and what biases you had in asking the questions. Are you leading the witness, so to speak, in saying, oh yeah, I played with magnets, putting them in electrical sockets every single day. Well, of course you didn't. You wouldn't be sitting here if you did. But it's it's part of what we do as epidemiologists, and it can be difficult, and the results that you can end up getting from that are not quite as good as if you had a test tube and you knew exactly what you put in the test tube. And so you end up with correlations of things that aren't maybe quite as well measured as they could be.
Thank you. What I want to do is move to the phase where we invite the community more fully into the conversation. Before I do that, I want to give Dr. Carpenter a chance to put another thought.
Well, you know, I think what Michael has described would be an ideal study, but that's not the way research is done in electromagnetic fields. But it does make the point that our exposure assessment is inadequate. Almost all studies, whether with power lines or with cell phones, look at people with the disease, whether that be brain cancer or leukemia, and look at people that don't have the disease, that are matched for age and sex and socioeconomic status. And then you ask the question, does the house you live in have high magnetic fields from the power line? Or how much cell phone usage did you have over the last 10 years as compared to people that don't have a cell phone? So the point that I would like to make is we know this is inadequate exposure. When you look at residents, you don't consider what happens at school, what happens when you go play somewhere. You're only dealing with one source of exposure. When you ask, do you use your cell phone, you're not considering all these other exposures. Yet those studies show statistically significant relationships. My point is because the exposure assessment is incomplete, those are going to dramatically underestimate the true risk. And that's why, as a public health official, I feel so strongly that this is a definite risk factor, but I don't know how great it is because nobody is unexposed. And the studies we do only identify one source of exposure in almost every study. So we're underestimating how bad this is.
Excellent. Can I ask if you want to ask a question to come to the microphone or give your card to somebody to come to the microphone for you?
Electrosensitivity is a very big concern. I know a number of people in this community who feel are electrosensitive. Years ago, when they had these 8-foot parabolic antennas to pick up satellite stuff, people would call me and say, I'm getting a headache every time I go in front of this device. I try and tell them, this is not a transmitter, this is receiving extremely weak signals and focusing on very low levels at the center. One thing that even occurs with talks like this is there are people who, I'm not sure if they're electrosensitive. That's a serious problem because they are suffering. And the suffering is, for instance, one person will not go into the library because of Wi-Fi. So knowing how a person's electrosensitivity, Dr. Rubin has studied 65 different studies in Europe, double-blind. A double-blind study is where the investigator or the person there and the subject does not know what a device is on or off. In the 65 different studies from Sweden all over Europe, there has been no effect that they could say that people could tell the difference. They do say they're still not sure. Yeah. Okay. What? There's actually two questions, I'm sorry. Because the other one I think is very important. How would you go ahead and determine if someone is electrosensitive? Here's another one. The Bioinitiative report that two of you are involved with has an exposure standard of no more than 0.1 microwatts per square centimeter. That's the one you'd like to have. I have both NARDA and Holiday expensive RF meters which are sent away periodically to be calibrated. I have measured the fields of Wi-Fi routers and computers serviced and the fields in the space between them. With Wi-Fi router and computers on, both the surface of the computers and the routers measured a maximum of 0.17, same units. The entire region between these two was less than 0.024 microwatts per square centimeter, extremely low. I turned off the router. The router no longer had any RF. Same thing in the immediate area. I don't know if the 0.02 is correct. The computer still had the 0.7. So you're going and wiring these computers. The computer is producing Wi-Fi. Yes, the question is, do you have any comments on this?
Martin?
No, I was going to defer to you. No, I'm no engineer, and my comments would not be. I think all I can say is that the standards that were quoted by at the Bioinitiative report were put down as a reasonable standard based on the scientific evidence that is contained within the report. It was not endorsed by everybody, but everybody wasn't polled to see what they actually found. I think that the important thing is that it was much lower than the standards that have been given by the authorities. And I think that's the main point to carry away, that the standards set in the Bioinitiative report have been set by the scientists who have been suggested, not set, they've been suggested by the scientists who've done the experiments, had a chance to assess the meaning of those levels, and have made that as a recommendation.
And I would only add to that those levels were identified as exposures in either humans, animals, or cells that did result in a clear adverse health effect. I think none of us felt that they were realistic to set as regulatory standards. But the point that they are thousands of times lower than what our federal and international standards are is an indication of how great the gap is between what those of us that work in this field feel is a level that is associated with adverse health risks, and the standards that are set by, in our case, the Federal Communications Commission and other federal and international agencies.
Different in Europe. The follow-on question is, was it different in Europe?
There are different standards in almost every country in the world. None of them, in my judgment, are protective of human health.
Another question?
Hi, my name is Steve Romine. I'm from Woodstock, and I used to be from West Virginia. My question is specifically for Dr. McCauley, because I know Dr. Blank and Dr. Carpenter would agree with me on this. Don't you think that wireless devices should be proven safe biologically before they deploy to the public, in light of the fact that no biological tests were done prior to them being made available?
What you're citing is basically what we call a precautionary principle. And adoption of the precautionary principle is kind of a societal thing. We have to get people to decide what they want. And that's where the discussion comes in about these. And so you've heard the evidence on both sides. I've tried to represent it as well as I could. And now you have to say, do we follow the precautionary principle and say, it has to be proven safe before it's used. That's the precautionary principle. Remember that if you want to do that, the precautionary principle can be applied to all sorts of things, some of which you may not be too happy about. Okay. The precautionary principle could be applied to traffic in town, right? If you've got traffic coming through town, that's a hazard, and it's a known hazard. And we know really well what the chances of being struck in traffic are. So what is safe? How do you prove it's safe? And what's the benefit of that safety? do you stop all traffic coming through town, for example? Maybe you should, and maybe you feel like you should. But it becomes a question of a social discourse at that point, and say, what do we adopt, and what do we feel we should adopt? And if you go back to public risk perception in that one handout page and look at all the things that influence public risk perception, I think you'll have a better understanding of your neighbors, maybe even of yourself, for wanting that level of protection. But it's, in a sense, it's not something that I can answer for you. The only thing I can do is to promote the discourse here.
Can I speak to that?
Please.
The precautionary principle really doesn't apply in this case. Precautionary principle says if you want to do something in society, you have to measure the cost of preventing this damage to the cost, the anticipated cost of the damage that will be done. In other words, it's basically an economic decision. I think a better parallel is the introduction of drugs, for example. Before a drug is introduced to the public, the company that is making that drug has to test it and indicate that it's safe, that it cannot be used and cause damage. And I think that's what's really missing. We don't have to worry about the devices that maybe the point is, one should not introduce new devices in there that have the potential to cause big damage. And that's already been shown. And yet they just keep on going more and more devices at higher and higher energies.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Raji Nevin, and I live here in Woodstock, New York. And first of all, I just want to say that I've done a lot of research on this issue over the past 1.5 to 2 years due to my own personal experience of being exposed to a smart meter on the other side of my bed where I was sleeping, and I got very ill. I never had any problems with electrosensitivity until that time, and now I definitely do, and it's not all in my mind. I wish it was. Secondly, I'd like to say I just want to advise, or not advise, but suggest, highly recommend to people that if you've not already read Dr. Martin's book, Overpowered, to please do so. It's one of the best books that I've ever read on this subject. It's very well-rounded, it's informational, and it's very easy to understand. I can't recommend it highly enough. Next, I have my question, which is for either Dr. Blank or Dr. Carpenter. Have you heard about the studies linking autism to EMF by Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, and how he claims that he has personally taken away all exposure of children that he works with of EMF, in other words, taking them out of those environments 100%, which is difficult, but he's done it. And he claims that he's completely cured these children. And he works exclusively with autistic children and chronically ill patients. And he also claims that there is a definite correlation to the rise in EMF in the environment and autistic children, and that the correlation is the same. So my question is, do either of you have any information about the relation between autism in children and EMF?
If I can answer that first, I think there is absolutely no convincing evidence of any relationship between EMF and autism. And I think the few people that have been writing reports based on the increased use of cell phones following the increased risk of autism are doing a disservice to the whole study, because they do not have evidence that anything related to EMF is causing autism. And I specifically, that study, as well as the chapter which I objected to in the most recent bioinitiative report, the 2012 issue. I think this is not evidence, it's hypothesis. Hypotheses are fine, but they should not be presented as evidence. I don't see any relationship between any documented association between EMF and autism. That's not to say there isn't one, What I'm saying is the studies done today are hypotheses that do not present evidence. And I really regret those studies getting the publicity they do. Autism is a terrible disease. Nobody has a clue what autism is due to. But I don't,
Vaccinations.
Dr. Blank?
There are many things. Let's not go there, but there are a lot of things.
Dr. Blank, did you want to comment on this?
Well, the Klinghardt studies are very, very small, and that's always been a criticism of studies that reach global or rather large conclusions with relatively few data. But I think that there's mounting evidence about the involvement of autism. I think that the Lee study, where he was following up the women who were exposed in pregnancy, and I think the fact that you have this kind of carryover, the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children, this kind of thing is, it's shocking when you think that even in the safety of the womb, of the uterus, the children are still subjected to these influences. It's not only the children that are going to school that are being subjected to the Wi-Fi, but all these other influences that are occurring while the mother is carrying this developing fetus during the 9 months. So I think that while one may object to individual studies and as not being strong enough to prove anything, I think there's enough caution, especially in, I found that study which I showed you with the results in Iceland, where the mutation rate and the rate of autism, schizophrenia, correlated with the mutations of the father in the father's genome, but not with the mother, which indicates that the males are being subjected to this kind of genetic damage as they live and they go about their ordinary lives. And I think that we should be open to this possibility. While individual studies may not be strong enough to back up the assertions that are made, they certainly are calls for alertness and for caution.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Manny Jo Green. I'm the environmental director for Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Carpenter on the volatilization of PCBs from the Hudson River and its sediments. New York State is undergoing thank goodness, is undergoing a process, a legal proceeding. The Public Service Commission is holding a proceeding called Reforming the Energy Vision in New York. And locally, Central Hudson is now allowing people to opt out of smart meters. So my questions are, how much better or safer are the alternative meters that they're using if people want to opt out of the so-called smart meters? And can we have a smart grid without smart meters?
well, I think we can have smart meters that are not wireless. And that's really the central issue. Smart meters are very complicated. They give very high intensity but very brief pulses. We talked a little bit about dirty electricity. One of the issues that is a major problem is we don't really have a good understanding of what characteristics of these waveforms are the most dangerous. The dirty electricity concept is that even with the 60 hertz signals, there's RF on top of it. They're transients and so forth. Smart meters, as they operate, give these enormous, brief but very high intense signals. And there is some evidence, it's not convincing, but there's some evidence that it's that rapid rise to very high levels that's causing the symptoms that are being seen in people. And again, this is more anecdotal. It hasn't been well studied, but there are a number of people that report electrohypersensitivity from smart meters. The whole syndrome of headaches and mental fatigue and that sort of thing. I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you how to do it properly. But I do know that if it's used in a wireless fashion, you're going to increase exposure, and that this is an unusual waveform that probably has more hazard than the usual sine wave.
Anyone else on that? In regard to the smart grid and smart meters, there's a very good monograph of about 50 pages called Getting Smarter About the Smart Grid. And the argument in the monograph is that smart grids operate at a level where we need aggregation of information. You don't need the individual precise information that you get from a smart meter. So there is no need to have smart meters in order to have a smart grid. I refer you to that publication.
Hi, thank you. My name is Brett Berry, and I live in Chichester, near Phoenicia. And I have many more questions than I came in with, but I'll try to focus it back to kids in schools. So there's a suggestion made that a school with Wi-Fi that is using that Wi-Fi for all of the student computers is worse than a school with Wi-Fi where those computers are hooked in with cables. So I'm just curious with Wi-Fi, with cell phones and everything else, a lot of times we don't have a lot of control over what we're exposed to, but how important are the devices in that equation as opposed to the signal that's coming out of the antennas?
If I understand your question correctly, it's a wired computer versus a wireless computer?
There was a mention that a school that has Wi-Fi capabilities and all the kids in that classroom, they're kind of creating this bubble of
Correct.
electromagnetic radiation because they're all using computers on that Wi-Fi network, whereas the school could have Wi-Fi, but if those computers are hardwired, is that a much less of a level of exposure for the kids, so that schools could have Wi-Fi, but not necessarily use it for everything. So I'm just curious, in that circumstance, devices versus having Wi-Fi, or devices versus having a cell signal, how does it weigh out?
Well, if all the computers are wired, then there's no purpose in having Wi-Fi. If there is Wi-Fi, and many of us have Wi-Fi in our homes. I do, my wife insisted. But, the router is way away from any place where we spend any time. Having Wi-Fi in your home, in the school, independent of how often it's used, is going to increase your radio frequency exposure to a small degree. If you concentrate many laptop computers all acting on Wi-Fi, then you're going to have much higher levels. So, Michael is right. This is a risk versus benefit consideration. There's the benefit of the convenience of not having to have the wired cable versus the risk that some increment of radio frequency exposure, and it is only an increment because there are multiple sources, that increment is going to cause significant increased risk of cognitive dysfunction in school, cancer later on in life. And my only point is that I think a logical person, a logical school administrator, is going to do what they can to still provide access to the internet, still provide appropriate instruction for the kids, and at the same time do what they can do at not any great difference in cost to reduce their exposure to something that causes harm.
Could I just add, the whole Wi-Fi business, most people will have Wi-Fi, who have them in their homes, don't bother to shut them off at night. There's absolutely no reason why they don't shut them off. It's the same reason you can power off your pocket, instead of putting it in your pocket and you power it off, you carry it around, you won't be getting the signal. When you're carrying your cell phone with you, the tower is checking where it is so it can send you a call when it comes into you. So it's constantly communicating. And the Wi-Fi has that same ability of being on all the time. People don't realize these things are on. If you realize these things are on, you don't want them on. And that's the problem with Wi-Fi in school. If you get it, you Wi-Fi the whole school. And you keep it on all the time. And you have to worry. You should really have it so that you use it in the specific areas where you want it, and then shut it off when it's not being used.
Very helpful.
Falls, New York. Dr. Carpenter, you mentioned the evidence of brain cancer from cell phones, and I didn't catch exactly what studies you were referring to or where I could find this hard evidence? Would it be in the bio-initiative report, for example?
Well, most of the references are in the bioinitiative report. I think I would point to two particular studies. The Interphone report, which was published a couple of years ago, was a World Health Organization plus cell phone company study done in multiple countries around the world. And it was very interesting because if you would read the main text of that report, you would say there's no problem. But if you read the supplemental online material, there they show clearly that the more hours you use your cell phone, the greater your risk of brain cancer, that using a cell phone for 10 years or more increases the risk of brain cancer, that it's only on the side of the head you use the cell phone, and so forth. The larger number of publications have come from the laboratory of Lennart Hardell in Sweden. He has a very recent review article out. He's showing really very consistent, statistically significant elevated risks of brain cancer in the Swedish population in relation to duration of use. The elevated risks are sort of between 2- and 4-fold, which isn't that everyone that uses a cell phone is going to get brain cancer, but it's a statistically significant elevated risk.
Okay, that's Hardell and the World Health Organization, then?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And the bioinitiative report certainly has those references, the 2012 version.
Hi, my name is Karen Charman, and I live in Shandaken, New York. When I was listening to Dr. McCauley's description of what actually constitutes scientific proof for harm for an environmental exposure, it really struck me why it's almost impossible to actually prove that there is any harm from any given environmental exposure, whether you're talking about Wi-Fi or pesticide exposure or any number of things. So what I would like to suggest is instead of just looking at these issues individually, nobody is exposed to just one thing. We're exposed to a sea of things, all kinds of different contaminants. And I think that when we as a society start looking at it more in the aggregate, it will be more helpful to us to figure out whether something is actually harmful or not. So I just wanted you guys to comment on that.
Yeah, let me start. That's a really, really good idea. That's really, really difficult to do. And on behalf of science, I apologize to you. I sincerely apologize to you because you are exactly right. That's what should be done, that we should be looking kind of at life, the universe and everything on these things, and we can't. And what happens is you get these things being broken down. And you're also right on the money when you talk about Hill's criteria. I mean, every epidemiologist worth his salt will quote Hill's criteria to you when they talk about causation. And it takes years. I started on a study of diesel exhaust and cancer and the association between the two in 1983, I believe it was. This past summer, the International Agency on Research in Cancer just declared diesel exhaust a carcinogen. That's how long it took.
But that also shows that the tools that science uses, which it then makes these statements that something is or is not safe, they're not adequate.
No, they're not adequate. They're not adequate. And as a scientist, I'm faced every day with how do I get funding to look into something? I'm looking for a funding source to redo that coal miner study because it's been 30 years. And when I did, and I forgot to mention this before, when I did the original study, there were only 40 miners with leukemia in that study. That's a really tiny number. We like to deal in numbers in the thousands. And so you do hear a lot of criticism coming back at your studies of, that was 40 people, you know, plus or minus one person with leukemia, and you could have the difference between significant and insignificant in a study that's small, you know. But you've also got to find the money and the funding, and when you rely on Congress, it's the disease of the week. So if I wanted to study Ebola right now, I probably got a good chance of studying Ebola right now. If I want to study electromagnetic fields, I got to do some really creative writing to get my funding for doing that. That's what we're beset by in trying to do science. It's not easy, and it's competitive, and the scientists' jobs rely on them getting funding. So they have to chase the disease of the week. And so even if they want to do electromagnetic fields, if they can't get funding for that, they can't keep their jobs in many cases.
So then science is not serving the society?
Yeah.
Not serving us well. Did you have a comment on that also, Dr. Carpenter? And
I think the point you make is a good one, that there are many, many different exposures that cause disease, often the same disease. This is basically what I do for a living. It's, you know, I'm working with diseases like diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure, and we're finding all kinds of risk factors. Some are diet, some are exercise, but some are chemical exposures. And, you know, it's a mistake to simply look at an association and draw the conclusion that there's causation involved there. So we need to look at these mixtures of exposures if we're going to really understand what causes disease.
before we take the next question, I do want to say that we did as a society manage to notice that smoking has a correlation with lung cancer, and we have managed to get lead out of gasoline. So there are some places where we have made some progress, but it can be difficult.
Hi, Deborah Copal from Orange County, New York. I'm a little concerned that some of the things that were said on the panel might leave people with the wrong impression. For example, they might think that they're more likely to get hit by traffic in the center of Woodstock than to get sick from Wi-Fi. And I think one of the things that's also been lost is that people perhaps don't understand the magnitude of how much radiation Wi-Fi is exposing people to. There's a number of cell tower studies that showed upwards of 10% of people having symptoms of electrosensitivity at levels that are less than what people are getting in a Wi-Fi classroom. To that other person's comment, yeah, there are some schools that I've talked to that have passive Wi-Fi transmitters with the administration where the kids are using hardwired computers, but the amount of radiation in that classroom is still more than if they were picnicking at the base of the cell tower, which is contraindicated by the CPUC as of 1993. So I'd like to hear just some discussion about some of these cell tower studies and talk about them in context so people understand that Wi-Fi is exposing their children to more than a cell tower. And in fact, to the electrosensitivity issue, there was a meeting of the European Social and Economic Committee last week. It's a consultative body in the EU that says it's now 3 to 5% of the population. That's a public health problem. I counted 5 people in this room that I know that have electrohypersensitivity. That's a lot of people, perhaps there are 250 people in here. And perhaps people with electrosensitivity were interested in coming to this forum, so it's not a representative number. But I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration. So I would like to hear about the cell tower studies, and I just want to read a quote from ICNIRP, which is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. They had a quote in a report in 2002. It's interesting because it's a body whose members have taken money from industry. And they say, different groups in a population may have differences in their ability to tolerate a particular non-ionizing radiation exposure. For example, children, the elderly, and some chronically ill people might have a lower tolerance to one or more forms of NIR than the rest of the population. Under such circumstances, it may be useful or necessary to develop separate guideline levels for different groups, but it may be more effective to adjust the guidelines to the general population. Some guidelines may still not provide adequate protection for certain sensitive individuals, nor for normal individuals exposed concomitantly to other agents, which may exacerbate the effect of NIR exposure. Where such exposure has been identified, appropriate specific advice should be developed within the context of scientific knowledge. So my question for all the panelists is, in what universe, what other substance or agent do we ubiquitously expose the population to and say, oh, it's only dangerous for children, adults, and some chronically ill people and not a problem for everyone? And also, I'd like you to comment on the fact, if someone's particularly exposed, that they're going to be chronically ill, and certainly we know from electrosensitive people that when they're away from the agent, they're not chronically ill.
Well, let me start off by correcting something. When I talked about the risk of being hit in traffic, I was talking about the precautionary principle. Not that it's necessarily a higher risk than suffering something from electromagnetic fields. It's just, it is risk. And we have to deal with all sorts of risks on a daily basis. And we have a way as a society of dealing with that. And we're going to try to apply those same principles here with electromagnetic fields. I think it's really important that it be a public discourse on this.
But you also said like 1 out of 250,000 might get chronic leukemia, but again, that's cancer electrosensitivity is 3 to 5% of the population. That's a heck of a lot more.
Yep, that is. And there are a lot of potential environmental problems here. I mean, I could go into my favorite ones too, and we could take the rest of the night. But that's not to belittle any single problem. It's just, it's a big issue, and that's what we were talking about just with the last questioner. So.
I think the issue of cell towers is also a significant one because they're going up everywhere. They're increasing. And most people have no say in where the cell towers are. As a matter of fact, the Telecommunications Act prohibits one from objecting placement of cell towers on the basis of health concerns, which I found absolutely outrageous. But, it is a source of exposure. There have not yet been very many studies, but the studies that have been done do show elevated disease in people that live close to cell towers.
Yeah, I would offer that the fact that we're able to, as a community, look at the question of what we should do with EMF, it can be helpful because we don't have the constraints on that aspect of the issue that we have with the FCC controlling cell towers. And if we start the conversation and educate ourselves about this aspect, make some changes and see how it goes, we may be in a better position to come back at the issue of the cell tower placements.
Hi, my name is Tara Ball. I live in Woodstock, New York. I'm not from here, but I did not live here. I spent about 6 years in the utility fields. I worked for Leica, Keyspan, Orange, Rockland, Central Hudson, National Grid, Con Ed. And I actually spent my 5 years surveying and doing straight voltage projects. I did auditing, I did all the QCing for the maps, and probably surveyed about 600,000 utility structures in 5 years. I spent time in substations. I spent time, I did underground electric, opening up with shields and gloves, the high voltage, making sure the transformers weren't leaking and so forth. So then 7 years later, during one of my surveys, 7 years ago, during my survey, I actually stepped in the swamp that burned all the skin off my foot. And now 7 years later, I ended up with a whole slew of organ problems. I've also had a long history. My grandma's sister died at 18 of leukemia. She was born in Buffalo, then went to Detroit, Michigan, and then died in Jamaica, Queens, probably about 1924. So there's a long history of health sensitivity. And I've definitely been affected. I'm 34 years old, and I'm living with my kidney with screening hospital right now. And it was cumulative. And after a car accident, I was done. I basically was like, everything's not flushing, it was uric acid in my body. And thank God I did not go to Kingston Hospital, because after they finished testing me with their red dyes, I'd probably not be here right now talking to you. So, my only question for you is, I know about Wi-Fi and high EMFs, and I used to walk around lost, in transformer stations trying to read polls and survey, something that I did every day, and, I just do what you see. My question is, have you guys done any research on new compact fluorescent bulbs that contain mercury and how they affect us? And have you think that's dirty electric? I had a lot of clients that work with, but now I do property management, huge network for chemical sensitivity out there. There's also a Dr. Diem. Is it Dr. Diem, Joe? Yes. Yes, okay. That deals with all this. So I just was wondering, have you guys done any research on the compact fluorescent bulbs and how they're really affecting people? Because I'm definitely affected by them. Do you know what I'm talking about? The curly little compact fluorescents.
Yeah, I think that our panel was selected based on their knowledge about this particular subject, so.
Well, they were talking about electric and current. I was just wondering, because I know that they contain high EMFs. I have clients that have had people come test them, and I've had clients who have headaches from them. So I was just wondering if you guys have done any research, and I also just wanted to bring
that aspect to the conversation. Subject for future research?
Okay. Some of the original research that started me into this, I got into this field by way of a volcano. Go figure. It was done by Sam Millam, who was the state epidemiologist in Washington State. And he was looking at electrical workers and excess risk of leukemia in electrical workers, and did find a correlation there. And he associated that with all of the work they were doing around these high power centers and all of that sort of stuff. And I'm hearing some of the same things from some of your background and experience.
Yeah, my kid had, I have a son who's 5, he had cognitive speech delays, he took a lot of B12 and omega-3s and changed his diet to bring him back. It's been huge. And if I didn't do what I did, he probably would have autism with, the chemical exposure. But I just wanted to know if you guys had done any, of the compact bulbs, because it's huge, and it's really, I believe it's as bad as Wi-Fi, so I just wanted to bring it to you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And because there are a lot of other environmental issues too, because we're talking about EMF here, that's not to say we should downplay anything else. And I go back to the lady before who was talking about multiple things. Yes?
I only had 1.5 minutes. Okay, one more thing.
We have only a little bit more time, and we still have 3 other people behind you, so.
I had a study. I'm just going to, never mind, forget it.
Yeah, if you can bring it to us in another way, that would be great. So we have about 5 more minutes, and I think we should be able to get everybody in if we make the questions brief, and the answers as well, which we have been doing. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marge Roberts. I live in Barrytown, New York, founder of Hudson Artists, and I have a Wi-Fi in my home, and I observed that down the hall in the next room, where I had an iPad, it charged itself without being plugged in. And I thought that was very odd. I'd like to hear what that means, if anything. Is that statistically significant? And if I turn off my battery, what about my wireless laptop and my iPad? Do I disconnect? Well, I can't disconnect them. They'll still run. But what's the best way to turn those off? I think I'm being deluged with Wi-Fi stuff.
Don't tell Apple.
Don't tell Apple.
This is a widespread complaint, apparently. Okay.
Yeah, like 38, it charged up to 100%. It's not plugged in. It's sitting there.
That would actually have to be an electrical field, not a magnetic field. And it goes back to one of the things that I mentioned before. Although we're talking about electromagnetic fields, you have to understand that a lot of the literature really is focused on magnetic and not the electrical. And I think there may be more there than that, and we've got to make more measurements, and we've got to get a better feel for our electrical field exposures besides the magnetic field.
Dr. Blank, would you recommend those devices that can reduce dirty electricity for protecting this house? Would that have any role?
Well, I have no experience with it, but people who use them claim that it does. But there have been a few reports that suggest that maybe they don't always work as well as they should. So that's like with any device.
Thank you.
For being a panel. And Carillion photography will measure the fields on the body. Maybe that would be useful in detecting any changes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. I'm an attorney, and I submitted lawsuits against Wi-Fi in school this year. And well, the question here is what I say. I thought that a little bit the discussion was only focusing on Wi-Fi, and there's a lot more to be said about Wi-Fi. And the last question, I'll make some more to Wi-Fi, because what we found out in our preparation is that the modulation of Wi-Fi is especially dangerous to the human body. And we found, for example, and I read some of Professor Carpenter's papers on the topic, is Wi-Fi works at 2.45 gigahertz, which is the same frequency which was chosen for the microwave oven because of its high penetration to human tissue. And what the other things we found about Wi-Fi is that it is a technology which is called frequency hopping. It constantly changes frequency when it works. So essentially what it creates is an effect of pulsing on the human body, which is already established to be something more difficult for the nervous system to tolerate. Then we found out that the Wi-Fi uses a signal called a beacon signal. And the beacon signal is a signal that the Wi-Fi router constantly sending, basically asking if someone needs me. That signal uses 10 Hz frequency. And the 10 Hz frequency is one of the same frequencies in the brain uses alpha brainwaves for from 27 to 13 Hz. And so what we know from, I'm a communication officer in this area as well, so we know that there's interference between two antennas, the two transmitters using the same frequency, it's actually interfering with each other. So if you have a Wi-Fi router constantly sending a 10 Hz signal, and the brain uses the same signal, the same frequency to operate, then there's a problem with the interfere with the operation of the brain. What we also found is that everyone who reported symptoms from EHS, not everyone, many people said that they react especially badly to Wi-Fi. And we actually suspect that's one of the reasons because it interferes with the way the brain works. Now, one of the things we found out, when you guys talk about science, I found science to be obsolete. And we mentioned the issue of tobacco, and okay, so I don't want to make this point. The point is, can you expand on the issue of the modulation and other effects that modulation radiation has on noxious intensity on the human body, which makes Wi-Fi more dangerous?
No.
It seems to me that you're offering a plausible explanation for some of the findings that we're beginning to see. And so I appreciate you bringing that in. Thank you. I'm going to ask that we let somebody else have a little bit of our tiny bit of remaining time. Thank you.
I will point out that there is some information on modulation in the literature, in the health effects literature. So people are kind of aware that it might be a problem for sure.
Next question.
Hello. First, thank you all very much for coming to our town and making our lives better. It's a pleasure. My name is Jay Wenk. I live in Woodstock. By chance, I'm on the Woodstock Town Board, and I'm a World War II veteran, and those are the bona fides. My question was touched on indirectly, and I would like to ask it very directly now. What is the relationship between the capitalist state that we live in and public health?
They're inversely correlated.
That was the right answer.
Thank you, Jay. We have time for one more question. Does somebody want to make a more direct response than that they're inversely correlated? The more you have a capitalist state, the less good public health you have. That's what my statement is.
That's unfortunately right.
Alex Lyons, Woodstock, New York. If there's a cancer cluster, and there was no cell tower before, and now there is one, to me, that's very strong evidence, and the fact that you hide behind this correlation thing when there's an obvious thing that just happened. If it was a crime scene, and there was a murder, you would have the cops and the corporation should be held accountable just like the criminals. They're bad guys, they're poisoning the earth, they're poisoning people, and we don't need to wait. We can smell it, we can see it, it's toxic, It's showing evidence. Should we have evidence? I mean, this correlation thing, I think they're hiding just like the FDA hides behind food and nanosilver curing Ebola and healing all kinds of diseases. They say, oh no, it's not proven to heal or cure any disease. That's just a lie. And the oil company is lying right now using toxic things that they shouldn't expose people to and rays they shouldn't expose people to. So if we have a choice not to, why not just say, whoops, we made a mistake and flip the switch and do something else? What do you think of that? That's it. We're not just experiment on the public without doing the test first.
Yeah.
Thank you. There were two more people around the corner. We're going to try to squeeze them in.
Hi, my name is Anthony Lee, and I'm in and out of Woodstock. But I just want to bring up a comment or respond to the woman's question on the CFC bulbs. I don't know if they actually do anything, but the LED light bulbs, when I turn one of those on, it actually causes interference on my radio right away.
Thank you.
My name is Barbara. I'm from this area. I wanted to know if any of you are familiar with lens neurofeedback. It's a treatment for people who have had brain injury, whether it's from an accident or stroke, where they find an area of the brain that's not working properly, and they take a very minute amount of radio waves and direct it towards that part of the brain. I wondered if you had heard about this treatment and what sort of place I could go for information about that.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know about that.
I believe there were some people in Stone Ridge that were using that technique. So if you want to contact me at Catskill Mountain Keeper, I'll try to track that down for you.
And they're having good results, but I wonder what the long-term effects are of taking radio waves and sending it towards specific parts of the brain.
I think it's a valid question and for another area for further study.
Okay, does anybody know of a place I could go to get more information about that?
No.
If you contact me later, I'll work with you on following up on that.
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you. We're multiplying behind the corner there. Okay, two more people.
Question. My name's Alona. I'm from Hurley. Do you know if direct current is better in terms of radiation than alternating current? The idea behind that would be since we were all on off-the-grid solar, and we use direct current.
From what I understand of this, the answer is yes. Direct current seems to be better than alternating current because it's a static field, and there's not a lot of indication. I can ask these two gentlemen whether they can answer that, but I don't think there's a lot of indication in the literature that static fields are quite the same problem.
I agree with that.
Interesting, thank you. Our final questioner.
I'm Barbara Stemke from Kingston. I've been working, Weston and I have been working with the Public Safety Committee of the Kingston Common Council to get a moratorium on smart meters in Kingston. Do you have any suggestions for us to convince them that it's a good idea for a moratorium?
I think the best suggestion is to mobilize the population of Kingston to insist with their elected officials. I mean, we are a democracy. It sometimes doesn't work very well. But the only way we're going to change that kind of issue is by counteracting the power of the utilities and exercise the power of the people.
I think that's a wonderful note on which we can conclude. We wanted to add in, we neglected to thank earlier Jeff Herringfield, who has been handling the sound for us so expertly in here. Thank you very much. Thank again all our panelists who traveled to come here and help educate us and inspire us. Thank you, everybody.